For more on the latest from the campaign trail, we're joined by NewsNation political and economic contributor Mick Mulvaney. He also served as White House Chief of Staff during the Trump administration and is the co-chair at Actum Strategic Advisors. Mick, good evening. How are you?
Nick, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me here on Sunday night.
Oh, I'm glad you're here so you can help us break this all down. You heard these numbers that Evan just talked about. Joe Biden raking in big bucks. President Trump still double digits ahead. As you just heard, probably the biggest news coming out of all of this race from this weekend is Ron DeSantis firing as many as 12 campaign staffers, with more expected in the coming weeks. He sits second behind the former president in both polling and fundraising. So why is he the first to make such a drastic move?
Nick, a couple different things. First of all, he raised a bunch of money when he first came out and announced for president, and they probably started spending money as if that was going to continue, and it hasn't quite continued. Keep in mind, and I know it makes for splashy news, firing 12 mid-level, low-level staffers isn't that big a deal for a campaign. Yes, you never want that story to get out there. You never want to have to lay people off at all, but it's not like it means the campaign is going to grind to a halt. It's a relatively small change. But again, you don't ever want to make even the smallest changes because it shows a little bit of weakness. Another one of the data points that you folks talked about was Biden's $72 million, which is a really good number. There's no question about it. But keep in mind, because he is the incumbent president, that number will reflect both his fundraising and the Democrat National Committee fundraising put together. None of the Republicans get the benefit of that because they're not the incumbent president. So generally speaking, Nick, the numbers are fairly soft across the board. Neither Trump nor Biden seem to be pulling in what Obama pulled in 2008 or what Trump pulled in 2020. So across the board, it looks like there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what happens.
Mick, is that because it's early? Is that because there's a lack of enthusiasm? Or is that just because, hey, Nick, they don't really have to focus on that just yet?
It's a little bit of both. It's July, which is a miserable time to raise money anyway. But the enthusiasm is, yeah, I mean, keep in mind, former President Trump continues to poll at about 50% in the Republican Party. That's lower than he would probably want. It's enough to win the primary. There's no question about it. But that means that half of the Republican voters aren't supporting him as of this moment. Over on the other side of the ledger, while President Biden's numbers are really good, keep an eye on that 16% for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That's not really a vote for RFK. That's the vote amongst Democrats who are willing to say publicly, at least to a pollster, that they don't support President Biden. If that stays in the 16 to low 20s, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. But if you see that number start to creep up into the upper 20s or maybe even the lower 30s, you'll start to hear more and more discussion about other Democrats possibly getting in the race because of President Biden's weakness.
Trump and Biden leading their party and campaign, raising money for their respective parties. But at the bottom of that, we saw both Mike Pence, the former VP, and we saw Chris Christie ahead of the former VP. Chris Christie seems to be gaining momentum.
He is, and there's actually a poll out from New Hampshire over the weekend that shows him a point behind DeSantis in third place. I think Trump polls around 50, DeSantis is at 11, and Christie is 10. Keep in mind, these two states, these two critical early states, Nick, Iowa and New Hampshire, are somewhat unique in the electoral system because they're so local. They're so rural is not the right word, but it's a very personal type of relationship that the voters have with the candidates. They want to see the candidates face to face. And it's really hard to spend as much time in both states as every candidate wants to do. So some will focus on Iowa and some will focus on New Hampshire. Chris Christie spent almost all of his time in New Hampshire beating up on President Trump, and it looks like he's gaining a little bit of traction in that critical early state.
Mick, is that an effective strategy? We've heard Mr. Christie say that the only way to beat Trump is to go through Trump.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. If he's got 50% and he's the former sitting president, he's polling at 50%. He's the ostensible head of the party still. You have to sort of go through him. I think what Chris Christie is really unique in his approach is that everybody else who's running against Donald Trump is sort of afraid to attack Donald Trump because they don't want to turn off his voters. They're sort of looking at everybody else going, well, I don't want to attack him. You attack him, because if you attack him, then his voters might come to me. Chris Christie doesn't seem to care about that. I think he's really just more interested in seeing Donald Trump lose, which makes for a fascinating kind of dynamic. It's sort of like the rest of the candidates should be giving a little bit of money to Chris Christie because he's doing the dirty work that they can't do. So it's a fascinating dynamic, especially in that early state of New Hampshire.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.